Hi, my name is Ken Asmussen. This is a technical video on the issues of trying to come up with prescriptions for microbiome dysfunction. And it's a multidimensional problem, and what I'm going to do is walk through each of the aspects which I've considered and have tried to address. The first thing to keep in mind is that I'm not a biologist or medical professional. The model which I'm working from is largely one of mathematics and number crunching, not of understanding complicated biological processes and making inference from them. In other words, it's far more objective than subjective or based on limited knowledge. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that this is a model. It is not something based on clinical experience. The advantage of having a model is you can take the information and extend it, make predictions, and ideally test the predictions. And if the predictions keep coming out true, then you will tend to trust the model more and more for making correct predictions, so that in the absence of clinical study, which usually is a slow multi-year process, you can go and make suggestions for patients particularly, which you can now try, especially if this nature of suggestion is low risk, like a change of diet, use a particular vitamin supplement, a particular herb or spice being added to their regular meal. So let's go through. We're going to build up the model and look at the factors which we try to consider. You look at the issues challenging the model, and the issue challenging the model is generally one of limited knowledge or poorly documented knowledge. We are also going to look at some of the approaches that can be done. There's more than one way. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2. It's x + y = z, and x and y can be many things. So it is a bit more abstract, putting things together in terms of one solution, look at some challenges, getting usable data, and then at the very end we are going to do a walkthrough of an actual example using the system which we have developed, which seems to be producing reasonably good results. So let's continue onwards. Let's look at a fictitious case to simply make it easier to understand what the issues are, rather than getting sidetracked into, wait a minute, something about this bacteria, that bacteria, and getting into nitpicking. Suppose we have a theoretical bacteria called Clostridium lenta. It consumes, that is, its substrate is the Clostridium form of vitamin D. It's nice and simple. Study shows that low levels are associated with a condition called fascism, high levels associated with a condition called anarchism, and moderately high levels are associated with painting on walls, slogans. So how do we treat this particular bacteria issue if it's out of the ideal range? Oops, 1 second. Okay, so the simplest case is for supplementation. If the person is exhibiting fascism, you want to have more. The question is, what is the dosage? How much vitamin D do we give the person? If you take a look at the RDA for vitamin D in Canada, we see 100 international units. But then when we dig into the history, we find that that is the dosage required to stop rickets from happening. Not necessarily to stop fascism, but rickets. The naive answer, which often is what ends up being handed out to patients, is 100 IU is sufficient. It's the RDA. What more could you possibly need? I mean, let's face it, that's the RDA. And let's go back and look at some mythical studies. We find association is, if you have 0.1%, we have it in terms of how much in a person's gut. we have a 95% chance of pushing fascism, 0.8 is 50% of fascism, 4.4 is 50% of anarchism, 12.6 is 90%. Notice it's a nice linear curve. It is a curve, not a linear line. What are we missing? We are missing any idea of what vitamin D levels are to species of bacteria. Key thing to remember, linearity does not exist with the microbiome. And that immediately usually raises the bar for understanding what's going on significantly, because we are no longer dealing with a linear relationship. We can try doing inference in lieu of studies. The ideal solution would be to do many long-term studies. Unfortunately, 20 years of studies trying to stop fascism in Germany or Italy or Spain doesn't really help. So what we can do is look at what we have available. First of all, we see on the bottom left, we have the distribution of the serum vitamin D levels for population. So we have a reference point. And we can see, okay, what percentage of people are fascists? Okay, so now we get a better idea of where things are. But then we have to go over and take a look at the distribution of the bacteria, and then we have a different type of curve here, with, of course, the median being right here, and we have a variety of upper and lower bounds, and the question is, which upper and which lower bound do we do? And that is where some of the art of dealing with the microbiome comes in. We can't say science, it's art, because it's not definitive. You end up making assumptions, and then those assumptions perhaps drives the numbers, but again, those assumptions are what drives the numbers. Okay, we could do a little bit of mathematics here, and we need to combine 3 different curves together, or 3 different functions together. One is the vitamin D level distribution, which is there we need to look at our linter percentage distribution, and we have to also look at the odds ratio for fascism and anarchism. So we have 3 different sets of numbers. Skipping the numbers and all the mathematics, the result may be desired range is 30 to 130 nanomoles per liter. Okay, so now we know what range we want people to move into, which is good. We now have a calculated range based on some hard numbers. Now we can go, and now that we know the range, we can look at the person's level, and we can actually compute. And here I give a citation to where we have a lovely formula spelled out with how much you need to raise the levels to certain levels. In terms of supplement level, I believe even factor in age as a factor for what levels, and gender, because both of those affect how much supplement you take of vitamin D for the blood level. So we have an example here back from 2004. So we take our linter level and project effective one and compute the amounts needed, and that's it. Not quite. While we need to also be aware of DNA, SNPs issues involved, for example, the VDN or genetic variation, which impacts the absorption and processing of vitamin D. So we have another layer of complexity on top of things. So in order to treat it, we actually end up getting even more layers of treatment factors to be considered. We can go with a cookbook, literally cookbook formula from the CIS study of how much to do. But once we give that dosage, we can't just walk away and say, okay, we are done. We need to come back and keep measuring the levels to see if it responds appropriately to that level. Once it does respond to it, or we reach a sufficient time doing it, then we may have to further increase or decrease the vitamin D level to keep it in the desired range. So it is an iterative process, and that's simply because of the complexity of the human body and human systems. Okay, so we aren't quite done yet. We forgot something. We forgot that the another bacterium called Multidimensional bonito. It produces a natural antibiotics called Camisa neura, translated from the Italian brown shirts, and it inhibits the growth of the lintel species, and by inhibiting it, it allows things to move closer to a fascism state. So, if the amount of bonito is too high, lintel will be greatly reduced despite the abundance of vitamin D supplement. So we may need to make additional changes to inhibit the bonito bacterium. Are we starting to have a bit of a fun complex? Remember, this is a simple, very simple, naive constructed case. We're already starting to look at some of the complexities involved. Well, what have we just learned? We need a lot of data that simply may not exist. Vitamin D I picked because we have beautiful things. We have documentation distributions. We have formulas available to calculate how much you need to make a required shift. We can grind through everything nicely. We even have fictitious odd distributions for association. So we have a beautiful set of numbers available. And we even know some interaction between bacteria, which could further complicate how we need to adjust things. And we're also aware we have DNA factor. So this is a simple, naive case. Very simple, making assumptions that we have information which we usually won't have, and we understand things generally better than we actually do. So let's switch to reality. Here is where the fun begins. And the fun is we end up often having too much information and not enough information at the same time. It's where my particular area, career-wise and academic training comes in, which is something called operations research, artificial intelligence engineering, fuzzy logic development. All those ends up being able to handle large volumes of data which we don't have enough data on. So it becomes a little bit of fun. Machine learning doesn't really apply here because we don't have enough data to do machine learning, which is why we end up going over to the fuzzy logic approach. Okay, we often have a microbiome with no significant metadata. For example, unexplained tiredness. The person doesn't have a condition like diabetes or cardiac issues or brain trauma. So we have just a basic microbiome and a symptom, headaches, mood swings, which we may not have much metadata on. We may also have, in our case, a microbiome with auxiliary information, for example, organic acid tests, which I often find that people I'm working with have that information available. Or a microbiome has one or more symptoms or conditions which has known association. And we have a very large number of conditions with associations. Simplest is, of course, things like Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, but it also finds it for Parkinson's, for MS, for pretty much every single medical condition that has been studied. There are distinctive microbiome shifts, and our assumption is that the microbiome shifts contribute to the symptoms of the condition. So what is the goal? The goal is to normalize the microbiome, and this is based on the belief that if we normalize the microbiome, generally the symptoms would be less severe, and in some cases, symptoms may totally disappear. There is no universal normal. The normal family doesn't have 2.2 kids. There is a range of normal depending on ethnic background, as in DNA, diet style, how much exercise they do, their age, their gender. Each one of them causes a different distribution of the microbiome, which of course makes things fun again because we may not have the data as to what normal is given just those 4 factors, and there's more factors than just those 4 to consider. We need to move again, we're trying to move to the normal range. The problem is we overload the meaning of the word normal. Often when people hear the word normal, they think about a normal distribution curve. Forget it. The microbiome ain't normal in any sense of a normal distribution curve. And a better term is probably a common range or desired range. Once you use the word normal distribution range, people immediately kick over to, get the mean and plus or minus 2 standard deviations, and we are good. Doesn't work that way. Sorry, I wish it did. It'd make my life a lot simpler. Okay, how to determine the desired range is, of course, the first question. There are many possible approaches, and basically you could end up picking approach or several of them out of the air and trying them. Classic way is 2 standard deviations of the mean of a reference population, which is what is usually used for laboratory studies, seeing what level vitamin D is in the blood or some other condition in the blood. Is done by taking the average of a population and plus or minus 2 standard deviations, and you run with that. Doesn't work with the microbiome, unfortunately. Use a technique called box and whiskers, which works a bit better. It's based on quantiles and extends that, and it produces often a bit better results, but it varies from bacteria to bacteria. Arbitrarily select the top or bottom n percentile, in other words, the top or bottom 5% or 2% or 1%. When we go back to using the mean and 2 standard deviations, that is what we are attempting to do. But here we actually get a large enough sample, which usually means 1,000 people or more, and finding out what the percentile ranking is. Or use proprietary methods that were in developing industries like finance or stock market and applying those techniques. And that depends whether or not you are aware of them, and in some cases whether or not you have permission to make use of them. So you have to determine your ranges by one or more methods, and I suggest more methods of determining ranges is better than less methods. We want to be wise. We want to know what we don't know and how to determine the ranges we don't know. Here's an example of ranges for a particular bacteria class, and as you can see, you see what the percentage reporting, it goes along and then it takes off, and I have on the chart we see where the median is, which is at the 50th percentile, exactly where it should be. We have box plot low is just about having anything is normal. Box plot high, we're sitting here, which is about 88 percentile, so 12% of people will come in being abnormal. Interesting. We have lab high, which is way up here, and lab low, I think, is somewhere down here too. In other words, everybody is normal. Forget it. Doesn't matter if you have beta photobacteria at all, you're normal. Good. Forget it. Ignore those bacteria. Or here we have something called a count of mole drop high, which drops the percentage being abnormal down to 5%, and count of low is here, so it gives you a different range. So the question is, which way do you go? That ends up, from my own experience, being one which comes from trying them, taking a look at the results for enough different bacteria that you get a feel for what you want to work with. I find that the count of mole drop ranges seems to work best trying to adjust it. Doesn't necessarily mean it picks the right one, but the net result is generally pretty good. We could go and do a more sophisticated way. Here we have the count of mole drop transformation, where we take the same data, and what you now see is almost a straight line, and now you can see where the low point here was picked, because here you start having an abnormal shape to the curve, and then up here we're also noticing a little abnormal shape. It's no longer this long middle flat point. And what are we doing? We are transforming the data using a monotonic increasing function. There are many out there. This particular one is one I have a propensity to use. Flags where in particular for the count of Molotov, is where the nth degree momentum becomes unusual, which we are assuming is significant because things are becoming abnormal. Not abnormal, but becoming unusual. And unusual changes in numbers are usually for statistician interesting, which is why this number becomes interesting and that number becomes interesting, because things are unusual. We can also go over to using ranges from a medical practitioner. These are usually done by ad hoc observation of a patient, which is good. It can become very biased towards the ethnic group and or diet. For example, if you are in Australia, which has a very high, or Argentina, which has very high meat consumption, versus India, where you may have a high percentage of people with vegans, you could have two totally different ranges of bacteria because of the diet. And often the practitioner ranges often go down to family or genus only, doesn't go down to species or strain. In other words, we are doing very broad painting of what is or is not significant, which is generally not ideal because often it is at the species or even strain level where we find the oddities happening. That is a particular species or a particular strain that's causing a problem. And usually when we have a practitioner suggestions, we have a small number of bacteria. Some cases perhaps 15, maybe 20 bacteria, although potentially 2,000, 3,000 different bacteria. I often am dealing with a 16S microbiome test, and it's not unusual to see 1,200 different species showing up for one person's sample. Shotgun, you can even go higher. You can get 3,000, 4,000 different bacteria being identified. So trying to reduce that to just 12 or 14 bacteria is not necessarily effective use of the data. So what you want to do, you want to pick your desired range, however you do it, and then comes the question, what do we do next? Ideally, it will produce a list of bacteria which you wish to increase or decrease. Now you know what you want to do. Now, you do need to be careful because of internet legend as to what it's supposed to be. You may be low in lactobacillus, and thereby, because people say you really need it, you really need lactobacillus, although in a general population, less than 30% of people have any lactobacillus coming back from tests. So the fact that you are low may not be really significant. In some conditions, high lactobacillus is associated with medical conditions. So make sure you are picking bacteria based on a reasonably good rationale. How do we do it? Once you got the bacteria you want to, now you need to find out how to change it. The easy way is to go over to the U.S. National Library of Medicine study, find out what substances are reported to increase or decrease specific bacteria. Here we encounter two problems. Often the reports are at the family, order, or genus level, so occasionally species. But the problem is the ones you're trying to modify may not be recorded by any of them, and you may not have that much information. And so we end up with information coming from the National Library of Medicine. Now, if you deem a substance to impact a bacteria like a genus has impact on its parent, the family, or its children species, then you will probably end up with, well, in my case, last time I checked the database, we have almost 2 million different relationships between a substance and the bacteria that it modified. That sounds huge, but it's also very sparse data. That is, if you look at a particular bacteria, you may, or a particular species, you may find absolutely nothing for that species. You may find one or two things for its parent. That's it. The number of bacteria we have is actually massive. So having 2 million relationships sounds impressive, but it's actually relatively sparse data. Now, with 2 million relationships, we want to optimize what the choices is. Okay, most studies have simplistic association with an increase. In an example we did, we had very hard numbers everywhere. In the real world, we don't have it. Studies are often in a ethnic or disease context. And in some cases, we find that for a particular condition, for example, IBS, that the shift of a substance on IBS varied according to subsets. One, it increases, the other one, it decreases, which means that we now have fuzziness whether or not the substance for a real person will increase or decrease. We have fuzziness there, which is another challenge. We actually see that in recent medical studies dealing with prescription drugs, that the microbiome of the person determines the effectiveness of the drug. We have the same thing for all our modifiers. Some may help, goes one way, some may go the other way. In general, there's a general trend, but we don't have definitiveness. And what we end up is in terms of my discipline, operations research, we have a trinary integer programming problem. Coefficients of our equations would probably reflect the number of studies showing the different possible directions shifts a priori unless you have more information. So we end up having a math problem, and the math problem is very big. It is probably somewhere about 3,000 columns in one direction, and for a particular individual, 1,000 columns in another one, which means you have 5,000 cells, 5 million cells, 5 million coefficient values that has to be determined, which usually is not done on a piece of paper. You end up having to do some serious programming. We have 4 states basically happening. We have things that increase. All the predominant study says they increase. We have decreases. Again, all the predominants find that it decreases. We have no information. We have no information on how inulin impacts a specific bacteria. Nobody studied it, or if they have studied it, they didn't find any statistical significance with its impact. And then we have contradictory, where some reports it increases and some report it decreases. Here you end up having to do some sort of rule of thumb as to determine what the level required for predominance is. My suggestion is the ratio should be about 4:1 to deem it to have a predominance. Anything less, it's fuzzy if you are doing Russian roulette as to what the reality is. So, we have a huge problem constructed. We put it into a good-sized computer. We let it run for a couple of hours. We come back with a solution. So we now know what substances should be taken or avoid. The avoid is easy. If you want to avoid, you reduce it as much as you can. But when it comes to take, we end up having a problem. Our example before, we fortunately had a study saying exactly how much you need to take in order to cause a desired shift. We don't have that usually. It's extremely rare. We could go with a naive approach, which is, oh, my multivitamin contains the RDA. I'm good. No, not quite. Give me a moment for coffee. Air quality outside is over 260, so Need something to keep my throat going. And going to the RDA approach, I often term that as a neo-homeopathic approach. The fact that you're taking something of substance means you're taking enough of a substance, which is basically almost homeopathic. Yes, I'm taking vitamin D. I'm doing my RDA. I'm taking inulin. Yes, I'm taking a quarter teaspoon, or it's included in my probiotic capsule, and the amount in there may be 0.5 milligram or 1/10 milligram. I'm taking it. I'm doing the right thing. The problem is dosage. Dosage becomes a significant pain. For known safe approaches, for some drug supplement, we are able to get dosages, and the dosage is, we can often find the maximum dosage used in studies with no or very low adverse effect. So the question is, we can at one point have practically nothing, but we're doing a token representation of supplement, or we can go all the way up to a high dosage which has been found safe and use that. And in general, I tend to prefer to go towards a higher dosage so that it is more certain that a shift will happen. And that means finding out what the higher dosage is, which means reading through clinical trials and studies to find out what dosages they were using, which is a good exercise in and by itself. We also have, once we get into suggestions, we may have to do some consideration. In the example which one of the recent blogs I did, all the suggestions for the person was meat, in chicken, here, increased cloning, intake, all of which is meat related. The problem is the person happens to be a Hindi. A vegetarian, lifelong vegetarian, which of course means that is inappropriate, or pork if the person is Jewish. Sometimes suggestions cannot be afforded. The person can't afford $95 a month for a particular probiotic, or something else. For example, Multidimensional can become very expensive when you look at shipping costs. The person is allergic or react to the suggestion, for example, peanuts and some nuts, celiac disease. Or if the person has mast cell dysfunction, taking a probiotic that is a known histamine producer is just not acceptable. All those factors are not in the model. It is a matter of the medical professional treating the person to be aware of them and do exclusion of certain items if they have a health issue. Other classic ones are high calories and obese individual. Other cases, suggestions when you come over to antibiotics or other drugs is other risks like fluoroquinolones are very notorious for causing all sorts of long-term lasting problems with muscles. So let's go on into this continuing saga. We have fuzzy logic issues. We do need to avoid being naive in handling studies. And usually it means we need to, for a coefficient for a big matrix to solve, we need to give values. Generally, if there's no contradictions, it's good solid. I assign a value of 1. If there are no studies at all, give a value of 0. If there's one in one direction and one in another direction, the so-called contradictory study, we end up actually having to give the value to be a -1. We don't want to use it. And why don't we want to use it despite having positive studies? Because it's a risk. We want to follow the do no harm principle. So we want to exclude items where we have a known risk to the use of it. Simple as that. It's not a 0, because 0 means we don't have any information. Here we have information, but the information is unclear. And then of course we have -1 by itself, which indicates that it shoves things in the wrong direction. The key thing about the contradictory state is always a negative of the direction desired. So in other words, for one case it may be negative, another case it may be positive, depending on the direction you're trying to shift things. So in other words, it's based on how you want the bacteria to shift. Generally, a mixture of studies indicated somewhere between a study value of 0.64 and 1. I use a 4:1 ratio in order to move it outside the contradictory state, and then I take basically the square root. So 4:1 gives you a 0.8. Take the square root of that, that's 0.64. So the coefficient is 0.64. If it's exact 4:1 ratio, if the ratio is higher, then the number starts creeping up towards mythical, magical 1.0. Okay, let's keep a little bit of a issue. I mentioned earlier the issue of the bacteria hierarchy. A study may report Bifidobacterium agenus is increased by HMO, a prebiotic. Do we apply this information to each species in the genus? After all, logically it seems, well, if Bifidobacteria goes up, then surely all the species in it should go up. In fact, shouldn't all the strains of each of these species, which are Bifidobacteria, also goes up? And wait a minute, let's go the other direction. This is the genus. If we go up to the family, since Bifidobacterium go up, shouldn't the family go up? And shouldn't the order above the family go up? Can't we just apply it for the whole hierarchy from top to bottom? And the answer is no. For HMO and other things, we find it impacts only some species and only some strains. So, and in some cases, the impact is the opposite for some species, some strains. Bifido as a population goes up. But within that genus, we have species going up or down depending on their composition. Similar going up into family and order, we have the same thing happen. And in that case, things are negatively impacting some of the siblings or the cousins of the genus, so we end up having issues there. To flip it over in terms of a human situation, something like a genus of Bifidobacterium is like a state. The state may, from a government grant, the average salary in the state may go up. Doesn't mean that every town in the state has a better income, or every street in the state has better income. Some may actually go worse. Similarly, if we improve the income in one specific state, doesn't mean that the income in all of the other states in the United States are going to improve, nor does it improve that all of the income of everybody in North America is going to improve. It's the same type of thing. The thing is not to overread the statistics. The statistics of the Bifidobacterium increases. It increases. Okay. Does a particular one, does Bifidobacterium increase? We technically don't know. We could, using fuzzy logic, create an estimate saying, oh, there is some possibility of increasing. So instead of giving it a value of 1, we give it a value of 0.2 or 0.5, indicating that it may contribute, but we don't want to give it as much weight as other ones. And the reason we don't want to give much weight because we don't have definitive knowledge about it. So, quick recap is issue selecting which bacteria to modify is the first thing. How to pick those bacteria. It's a pain. And it's complicated, and there's no easy thing. Keep in mind, we don't know how to select it properly. We can take wild guesses, and they are wild guesses, and we can run the guess and see what happens. We have issues selecting substances because the data we're working from often is very selective and not applied. Sometimes the studies are for people with a specific condition. If your patient or your person has the same conditions, it probably has a better chance of applying. If it's a totally different condition, may not apply, but we may have no information for that condition. The so-called sparseness of data issue. Then we go along and find a problem of what dosage do we select? That is a habitual pain. My own take is find the highest dosage from clinical trials or actually published studies and use that because somebody has done their homework in figuring out what those dosage are. When you have thousands of items, you're really going to have problems trying to figure that out without a massive number of clinical studies. And basically we end up with issues of having sparse data, trying to infer things where we don't have data, and we end up with basically a very fuzzy set of equations to work through. Assuming you work through all of these, and you go and you make a suggestion, then basically you want to see if it's effective or not. And what do? We take the original sample, go and get suggestions, apply the suggestions, retest after 2 months, 3 months, and see if things have improved or not. My general experience is we're seeing usually 2/3 or a bit higher improve, or perhaps 1/3 worsen or go nowhere. Generally, it's go nowhere rather than worsen. So that is how you end up testing the algorithm, but that is a slow iterative process. You may also have information coming about auxiliary data about the person. For example, the organic acid tests. And it includes all sorts of things from TNF alpha to interleukin 6, HDL, etc. And that information actually can be very helpful in an indirect method. For example, we take 4-hydroxybenzonate. We can go over to the Kyoto Encyclopedia of Gene Genomics, kegg.jp for the website, and we can determine the enzymes involved and trace the enzyme back to the bacteria with those enzymes. And Kegg provides information on what bacteria are producers and consumers, i.e. substrates, for this particular compound. So we can identify the bacteria we want to increase or to decrease to shift the level of this. In other words, we have another way of selecting what bacteria we want to modify. In this case, some of the items may be, quote, in a normal range, but because we have low levels, we want to really actually encourage those bacteria to be a little bit more prolific. And in some cases, we are lucky. The enzymes or the components or the compounds we are wanting to do happens to also be available as probiotics, and we use the Kegg data to find out what the impact, what the enzyme being produced by those probiotics are. And in some cases probiotics are suggested to be avoided because it will just push certain enzymes even higher than they are intended to be. So it basically gives additional ways of looking at it. So auxiliary data can be helpful in selecting which bacteria you want to include and which direction you want those bacteria to include. As I said, there's nothing simple about things. It is a complicated complexity. Suggestion process is almost the same. We take the number of bacteria and we use the ternary integer programming model. Generally, if we're using things like oats, and say our concern is the oats value, not something else, then the number of bacteria we are looking at would generally be greatly reduced. so we have a simpler problem to solve. Less CPU time required, and we do have the additional option of being able to, from KEGG data alone, suggesting probiotics, which may never have been studied in a clinical study, but based on the KEGG and the missing enzymes or the shortage of enzymes, we say, hey, you want to, what's typical for a certain population, you want to take E. coli probiotics such as Mutaflor, Symbiflor 2, because it produces the missing enzymes, which you are short of. So it's basically an interesting and truly a novel suggestion, which is based on the models, the genes and the genomics involved in the person's microbiome and the genes and genomics of the bacteria in probiotics. We could also go one step further. We could, for things like the measures in the allostatic load, go and see what increases or decreases it. And we could actually add those in as additional equations in our big equation, as in, okay, we want this to go up or we want this to go down, and these are things that cause us to go up or go down. Again, we're just adding more lines of equations into our already complicated 5 million cell problem. We may be up to 7 million cells or 10 million cells, which we're trying to determine the coefficient for every single one of those 10 million cells. Okay, now, one thing I should come back to is when we are dealing with a microbiome with a clinical condition or symptoms, and we have studies on those things, and those studies says these bacteria are too high, these bacteria are too low for a particular study, we have to stop cold and say, hold it, that's sweet, that's nice, but that may not apply for my microbiome sample. Huh? What? Basically, it only applies if all the preconditions are met. All using the same laboratory and the same methods. The same method uses the same software to identify the bacteria. The microbiome examiner must use the same lab and the same method. You cannot use alternatives. Sorry, forget it. And down there we have Scott Jackson, who basically states it very simply. You got 97 different ways to do the same raw data, as in FASTQ files or other physical data file, and you get 97 different answers. Okay, you got 97 answers, and so you're picking one of those for what is reported from the studies, and you're picking another one of those for your patient, and you're saying they're going to be the same matching numbers. They ain't. That is a major problem, and it is solvable. I've done a series of special studies which uses one commercial lab, and we are able to, for anybody who uses a commercial lab, go and identify shifts which are significant, and the results of those are interesting, but that's a totally different topic. But it means that if you have a symptom or conditions from one of the special studies, all you have to do is send it to this one lab, which is our base lab, for one reason only, not because we prefer them, but simply because we have the most samples from them, so we have the most for our reference population to compare, so we get the best statistical significance coming out of it. Short list of bacteria. Matching bacteria whose shifts matches the aggregate study is obvious, of course, but here we do have a few challenges. If you're talking about published PubMed studies, usually the criteria is very simple. It is statistically significant that the average of people with the condition is different than the average of the population who are healthy controls. That depends very much on the population size of the two, and the difference could be a little difference or it could be a massive difference. Most of the time you won't get that information. You'll just get, yes, it's a statistically significant higher average. That is not particularly great information to be able to be applied to an individual patient's microbiome. And we have additional problems. If the bacteria is missing, not detected, it's more complicated. Do we deem that to be a zero or not? And I would argue that we shouldn't treat it to be a zero, mainly because of my evolving understanding of how we need to view the microbiome to be actionable on it. Example is, if bacteria is seen only 10% of samples, should we include it as zero or not? You go down two different calculation paths and confusions making that assumption. And it's up to you whether or not you choose it. I know I've gone to the exclusion of it simply because, let's say, experience. And now we end up with the last factor. One more factor to consider is, how is the significance? How significant is the bacteria that is 0.01% above the limit or 50% above the limit? Do you give them equal weight or do we give them different weight? And if we give them different weight, how do we determine the weight? Example, back to our thing. One is a 5.04, desired range 5.01. So it is less than 1% difference between them. In our case, we have it how should we say, 1,000 times difference. How much weight do you give to that bacteria? And how do you do it? There's many ways of trying to do the importance here. One simple but naive solution is only use modifier that has undisputed positive impact on every bacteria considered. Nice conceptually, but when we go down to it, we quickly find the number of modifiers approaching zero. There's nothing left. The more bacteria you include, the less likely you are to find anything that will match that pattern. And if you go down to a smaller and smaller number, you will likely find something. But that is unlikely to fix a dysfunctional microbiome. So that's part of the ongoing problem. How do we give the weight? Do I count the distance in terms of how far it is from the desired range? If you are, for example, dealing with a 16S sample, the numbers are all out of million. So if one is 500 for desired max level and you're 510, that gives you a value of 10. If it's 50,000 and you're 80,000, that gives you a weighting of 30,000. In other words, one is 10 and one is 30,000 in terms of the relative weight. To do it by the percentage, in one case, the 10 is would be 5%. In other cases, 50%. Do you do it that way? Do you do a function, the square root of the percentage, the square root of the absolute distance? Do you do it on the statistical probability or on the percentile? And we end up with having to figure out what weight do we give it to it. And that weight becomes a coefficient of the equations. And you change the weight and the result from the equations will be different. Once you have your suggestions, we go over to the joyous thing called cross-validation. Are the suggestions reasonable is a key question. The conditions I originally looked at fortunately had a lot of literature on what helped or didn't help this particular condition. So when somebody came in with that condition, I could go and compute the suggestions, then can examine the literature, see if any of the suggestions in the literature, if they are, does the literature suggest that this will improve the condition? And if the answer is yes, we have cross-validation. And in which case, we know our model is reasonably well in predicting. If we don't do cross-validation, we are shooting crap, as in the game, not the pre-fertilizer product. Now, all the way through, I've mentioned that things the coefficients will and the fuzzy logic will determine what the suggestions are. And they will be different depending on what your assumptions are. And what we ended up doing is using Monte Carlo consensus building. That is, we go and run it through 15 different ways of doing things, 15 different sets of assumptions, compute things out, and then see what the net result is. See where we have consensus between the models as to what you should take, and where we have disagreements, and where we have consensus on what you should avoid. And what we're doing is saying, we don't know what the right answer is, but we figure we'll get a better answer by doing a Monte Carlo simulation. Very much the operation research person me speaking, saying, okay, excuse me, this is how you solve the problem of fuzzy data. And it is. It's a good way of doing it, but it means lots of computations and then lots of aggregation. We find that our solutions are sensitive to the weight we give to it. It's sensitive to which bacteria we are selected to be included, and whether or not we give significance to whether or not a rare bacteria appears or doesn't appear. In other words, the frequency of it can become part of the equations. So if you have a rare bacteria which shows up 80% of the time with people of a rare condition, but shows up 5% of your reference population, the fact that you have some, regardless of the value, becomes a significant factor for what you want to modify. Because if it shows up 80%, you really want to reduce that bacteria incidence, which means that even though you may have a low level, you want to reduce it, even though you have the 5 percentile range, which normally you say, oh, no problem. But in this case, you do based on the frequency of that bacteria in your target population versus your reference population. One more factor to toss in. Okay, if you love numbers, it's an enjoyable problem. If you don't like numbers, it's a good headache. So, summary is the basic issue construction of a trinary integer programming problem. The number of rows and number of columns gets significant. You have lots of parameters to be estimated. Each way of estimation is different, and the estimate determines what the suggestions are. Once a model is built for well-studied conditions, cross-validation should be done to confirm and further tune the parameters you're using so that you're getting better predictions, so it's consistent with clinical studies. It's an iterative process with a lot of moving parts. Can it be done? Answer is yes. We have done it. And we continue to tune our results, but we have done it as in we are consistently getting positive results for different conditions where people have not made progress for, in some cases, years. Suddenly they are starting to improve. And one of the main things we do is we use a citizen science approach to test and tune. People upload their samples. We generate their suggestions. We give it to them. They can try it. If they try it, usually they come back in 2 or 3 months with their updated samples. We look at it again, cycle repeat. We make it clear that this is an iterative process. If we cannot work from one sample and clear, we'll take one sample, move it to the next state, move it to the next state, move it to the next state. But each time we see a movement, we can show statistically that the amount of gut malfunction has gone down, which means, well, the algorithm is working. Whether or not it is apparent to the person is, of course, always questionable, but in general, we get people reporting A, B, and C, and D improve. Some cases, E may have gotten worse, but that is more a side effect of the shift, but the overall microbiome dysfunction has gone down. We could try looking at doing formal studies, but a couple of things. One is it's slow. It takes years to get formal studies out. When we are doing suggestions using things such as diet, supplement, etc., it is low risk to give the suggestion, and we can just do it fast. So we are able to respond immediately to a person's needs, and iteratively tune our suggestions as we get more data on. So it's a dynamic clinical trial, without the rigorousness of controls. Future potential. Right now, I'm working with a long COVID support group, and they report our suggestions improve many of their groups, which is a good thing, especially with long COVID, which is usually a wipe-out for treatment. It is ideal to identify treatment candidates we're studying in clinical studies, because, hey, wait a minute, this substance which nobody has randomly picked from the air for clinical study is predicted to help. So why don't we go and do a clinical study on it to verify whether or not it helps or not? And once we get that study result, we can then add that to a database. I'll make our prediction database even better. So it ends up being the right way of going, the classical way. But we don't depend on the formal clinical study to be done. It does give the choice of being able to suggest things that are worthwhile doing a study on, better spending your clinical study bucks. What our core assumptions are is the microbiome shifts contribute to symptoms and symptom severity. Many studies, published studies, indicate that's just the case. In a few cases, a microbiome alone may create the conditions, like the digestive systems with Crohn's disease, with irritable bowel syndrome, etc. Chronic fatigue syndrome seems to also fit that one. So, in which case you fix the microbiome, hey, the person goes into apparent remission. And next week, I'm going to walk through and look at actual example to illustrate the Monte Carlo approach. And the person sample we look at has progressive supranuclear palsy with type 2 diabetes to make things even more fun. Usually this condition is classed with Parkinson's disease, but it doesn't respond to Parkinson's medication. So what we can do is take a look, and as you'll see, the microbiome shift seen with this person who has this condition is not anywhere close to that of Parkinson's disease. So this is for microbiome, and thereby, if we're working for the microbiome alone, we may have better luck in mitigating the disease and disease irritations. Hi, this is using our public, free for individual site, microbiomeprescription.com, and I want to take you through the particular person who I just cited. The person who has been granted us permission to use the sample without identifying. The sample is nicknamed mother-in-law. And first thing we want to take a look at is lab sample quality. The lab which we're dealing with happens to give quality information. And we see we have the sample we are looking at as a sample of 10.6, and another sample is 3.6. Now, why is this significant? Well, it's like trying to predict the result of a national election. Do you ask 10 people and use that to make a prediction? Do you ask 100? Do you ask 1,000? Do you ask 10,000? More people you ask, the more likely you are to get a accurate answer. So here we have a big difference here. First case, we see almost 1,000 bacteria are identified. We have just 223 bacteria identified. And then we have the breakdown in terms of percentile ranking, as in 23 have numbers which are sufficiently high that less than 1% people have numbers that high. Breakdown, and then we have all sorts of additional things spelled down, as in ranges, enzymes, percentile ranking, etc. So we have a whole bunch of things, but that isn't the purpose of it, apart from showing that the lab read quality is something to really be aware of, because it does impact the equations and your choices, and also impacts the judgment as to whether things improve or have gotten worse between samples. I've seen cases where tremendous improvement, and the sample quality did a nosedive. And then the next one, tremendous deterioration, but it was better than the first one, but worse than the second one, and the sample quality went up. So it becomes even more moving parts for this jigsaw puzzle. So let's go over and look at the changing microbiome. We have a bunch of things here in terms of things are special studies, and these are things which are all using the same labs, and lab being used the same one this person went through, so we can go and do things. And we see variety of things here. It found viral disease, so the percentage of matches to the pattern which is there. Not predictive, but they are basically good for reference. And if we go over to health analysis, we'll see things where we see how well things matches the information done on PubMed. So we have a variety of conditions here. Alzheimer's disease, we have 99 percentile. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's has there. Do we have Parkinson's on the list? No, it didn't quite make it. Actually, Parkinson is on the list, but it is not a good fit, which seems to agree with the literature, which is the Parkinson treatment does not work well with this particular condition, PSP. So we could go and say, okay, well, wait a minute, what do we have a good match for? We have Alzheimer's disease. So what we can go over here is just click here, and we'll end up getting suggestions, which means what we do is we filter the bacteria to only those which are reported in PubMed studies and which shows the same type of shift. As in, if it's higher, then are their values higher than the values which we have, or lower, and we see a variety of things being suggested. And the confidence number here is a reflection of the number of studies showing desired effect on the number of bacteria it has a desired effect on. And everything is based on a magical 1. Everything is scaled, so the highest value positive and negative is a 1. And everything is then relative to that, so it ends up being meaningful when you go from one suggestion to the next one. They are somewhat agreeable, and we have things being listed, some cases probiotics things, we even list out which commercial probiotics are good ones. We only have a small number in this case, and then mixed results and no impact, and then we have the ones which are to be avoided, as in they're predicted to have only negative impact. And I have had many cases where people said, you know, based on your post, I stopped taking Lactobacillus adelphicus, and suddenly within 2 days, I was feeling much better, and my mental abilities improved greatly. So sometimes the negative impact, identifying things to be avoided, can have a quick, short-term impact on people. So that was one using the special studies, and now let's go back into health analysis. So we have spelling out of all the things which have known risks. As you can see, well, we have lots of bacteria which are of significant there, things not healthy bacteria. We have due diligence, as in we'll give a link to the citation where the data comes from, so you can check to see if there are any constraints on the suggestion. Then we have the suggested ranges from a medical professional who has granted permission for us to use his work here, and you can see his high-low ranges, their value, and whether or not it's ideal or not. For example, Akkermansia here is deemed to be not ideal. He has a little, or she has a little bit, but not very much. Bifidobacteria is a bit high. Other things are a bit low, etc. So again, a lot of these suggestions comes from clinical practice and can have a variety of challenges to it, as in what the population base is. It's the same as the one you're working with. In this case, these numbers actually came from using Microbiome labs data, which is no longer business, so you can't really use the numbers in a technical sense, but they are, as unfortunately is the case, better than nothing. They are at least something to work from. And now we go over to changing the microbiome, and we have some mechanical ways of selecting things here, and we are going to use this set of ranges, which comes from one of the we do have the options of only dealing with low bacteria or high bacteria or both. And we have the suggestions here. We'll see some of them are familiar, like Planetarium was on the other one. We get new things showing up, barley. On the void, we get similar things on the void. HMO was on the void before, happened to be at the top, but it's there, inulin, etc. So you end up getting a combination there. And going back, we'll go back and we're going to do standard labs, same thing. We have things, and we have barley here, which was on the last one. Numbers aren't that high. We have things to avoid over here. And we find that it is literally a different set of things with some overlap, but not a great amount, which is why we end up going the Monte Carlo approach, so that we are not dependent on getting a perfect algorithm. We try multiple algorithms. We're going to do box plot next. And hey, we have HMO again being on a void. Was on the last one, was on the prior two ones. So 3 out of the 4 has set as a high to avoid. And we have things here, and we don't have any probiotics in the top of the list, which we did on the prior ones. So it is different strokes for different folks, literally. Caltoph Maltrop. And here we have things here. Again, HMO is again a to avoid, keeps showing up as to avoid. And then we have Ramosis showing up here, additional 1 or 2 other ones, vitamin D, etc. So we end up with multiples there. We could go back and take a look, and I think that covers the main one. We could do each one, etc. We can also go over and just see what data derived from cake suggests for probiotics. And there we have things there. We have E. coli is sitting there, even though the person was relatively high in E. coli. It's as a probiotic, it does come up as a suggestion. And then there, all these bacteria are available in some probiotics somewhere in the world. Whether or not they're available to you is, of course, the nasty bottom line question. Okay, so now if I go back to here, we do have a consensus report. We can just click here, view the consensus. This is the result of the Monte Carlo simulation. We see things listed here going down by grand total, how many times it was suggested to as a take, how many times as an avoid. Here you see something as take 12 times, avoid 0 times, 10 times, 0, 12, 0, etc. If you go and change priority, we'll find the list of items, which is avoid every single time, or in some cases HMO, which we saw on some of them 2 times it shows up as a take, 10 times it shows up as to avoid. Artificial aggregation is sitting here. So you see it's pretty much near the top of the void list. So we can go and do there. We can go over and if we on the site, we can do things like selecting which probiotics are the ones which are suggested and the estimated weight. We did notice, for example, Akkermansia, a person was below the desired range, and here we have it as being suggestions to help improve the microbiome. Bifidobacterium was actually slightly above the usual range, but we find it showing up very often, but we also hit some other probiotics coming up there too. So we have listed, and we even have E. coli down here, multiflora being a positive with 6 in favor, 3 opposed, so it's more dicey one there, depending on the algorithm. So that's basically the long and the short of how the consensus is built up, and it gives you all the detailed numbers through it. And how many do we have? We have 1,821 different substances listed. So spreadsheet would be 1,821 across. Down the left side could be 960 items. And we have done, in this case, just 5, but there's 12 there. So we did that 12 times. So we're talking about a very good amount of CPU time being consumed to calculate these results. Okay, I think at this point in time, I'll shut up and just say the site is there, make use of it. And I encourage people to try doing their own solutions. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm doing the best I can in coming to the best answer given the state of the knowledge, and the state of the knowledge and the data density is horribly sparse. So it is a challenge, put it mildly.